I just want to begin this year with a very interesting event, which I think it's an astronomical event, which basically has, I think, a lot of significance, and that is that Cheshvan is a special month, and I want to point that out why. Anyway, before I begin, this year should be a merit for the health and success of the families of Regina Bas Yosef Ruvain and Yeshaya ben Yisrael, and Binyamin Wolf ben Tzvi Hersh, and Baruch ben Binyamin Wolf. Also, it should be for Refuah Shalema for David Tzvi ben Sarah. He should have a Refuah Shalema. Okay.
Also, Rina Bat Sol, Refuah Shalema.
And also Rina Bas Sol.
Yes.
Rina Bas Sol, she should also have a Refuah Shlema. Okay. So therefore, Cheshvan is a very special month, which is really very interesting. And so therefore, in fact, Cheshvan really is a Messianic month, which is interesting. And the first sign of that is, of all the months of the year, Cheshvan is the only month that has no Yom Kodesh, no holiday of any sort, whether it be a regular holiday, whether it be a fast day, whatever. It has no day which is considered some type of a holy day, and therefore they refer to it as Mar Cheshvan, bitter Cheshvan. And one of the reasons for that, so the question is, in the end of time, how is Cheshvan, the month, going to be consoled? Imagine the entire history of the Jewish people. There's not one important day, a holiday or whatever, that occurs on Cheshvan. And that, like I say, and that's why we refer to it as Mar Cheshvan, the bitter Cheshvan. How is it going to be consoled? Well, the answer is basically is that month is a Messianic month. In some way, Cheshvan may be the start of the turnaround. It may be the start of the release of Mashiach ben Yosef in terms of Cheshvan. So there's something of a Messianic occurrence that happens in Cheshvan. And that's why, in the end of time, it will be the greatest month of all, because the redemption, in a certain way, whatever stage of the redemption, will happen in Cheshvan. The second thing, which is very interesting, is Cheshvan also, Yud Aleph Cheshvan, the 11th day of Cheshvan, right, is the Yahrzeit of Rachel Imenu. And Rachel Imenu died on Yud Aleph Cheshvan, as you can easily attest to, because that's when all the people in Eretz Yisrael go to her kever. And we know that Rachel Imenu was responsible for the redemption. She's the one who prayed. They stopped at her grave on the way to Babylon, in the exile of Babel. They stopped at her gravesite, and they prayed that she should intercede. And lo and behold, I once spoke about this on, I think, Yud Aleph Cheshvan Shiur or Tishbav Shiur, whatever, that she was successful. And therefore God said that, originally I was going to exile them all the way till the Messianic era. But now I'll only exile them in Babylon for 70 years. So she actually turned around the exile, you see? And as a result of that, she is known as the mother of redemption. In fact, the Haftorah, which is dedicated to her, which is Yirmiyahu 31, Lamed Aleph, it talks about her. And God says to her, that, dry your tears, because I will yet bring back the Jewish people to their land. So she is known as the mother of redemption. And her Yahrzeit, she died on Yud Aleph Cheshvan, to be buried in that place where the Jews would go past there And they would, of course, ask her to intercede, and she would. So the day of her death, which is Yud Aleph Cheshvan, is a very important day, you see, because she died on that day, because that was the place that the Jews would go through, and they would ask her to intercede, and she would be successful. So therefore, Yud Aleph Cheshvan, which is her Yahrzeit, is a very propitious day for some type of Messianic situation. So that's a second idea. A third idea is really, I once gave a shiur that Yud Aleph Cheshvan is the day that the Or Rishon, which is the Messianic light, the Or Rishon, the first light, or the Or Mashiach, the Messianic light, was supposed to come down to the world, but it didn't. Instead, its physical analog, which was water, the mabul, happened not on the 11th, but on the 17th and 18th of Cheshvan, because on Yud Aleph Cheshvan, Mesushelach, the oldest person who ever lived, 969 years, he died. And the Rabbanu Shalom, God did not want to intercede or distract to bring the mabul on the first day of his death, because it would take 7 days for the Shiva. And that ended on the 17th, 18th day. So the mabul, which should have been the Or Rishon, became the mabul and destroyed the world. And I had spoken about that, in terms of Noach and in terms of Yud Aleph Cheshvan and so on. In any case, so therefore Yud Aleph Cheshvan is really a day that the Or Rishon, the Or Mashiach, the Or Hagonos, the concealed light, seems to happen. So that's a third concept of why Cheshvan is so important. Now, therefore, Cheshvan is not an ordinary month, you see. And therefore, what's interesting is that on Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan, there was a solar eclipse on that day. Now, we know that an eclipse can only happen on Rosh Chodesh because the moon goes in front of the sun. But most of the times, the moon is above the sun or below the sun. But sometimes it goes right across the sun and it blocks the sun's light. That is called a solar eclipse. And therefore, on Rosh Chodesh is the only time that an eclipse can happen. Well, guess what? It happened on Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan. And a solar eclipse means that it's a very bad sign for the Goyim. So, like I once said, for there to be a solar eclipse on Cheshvan, which is a Messianic month, is a very good sign for the Jews. And you never know. Maybe this month is it. Maybe this month will be the turnaround. Like I say, because if you recall, I had predicted also in Teves, if you remember, that in Hanukkah I gave the whole shiur. There was a solar eclipse in Rosh Chodesh Teves, which is the month of Esav, right? And I predicted that Esav will have a terrible time, and right after that, you had the collapse of Russia, Europe, and the United States, and they're all collapsing. In any case, so hopefully this will happen, that this month will be the beginning of the turnaround and the initiation of the Messianic process. Anyway, I think that was worthy of mentioning, for those people who certainly have hope for the Mashiach to come. Now, what I wanted to speak about is Parshas Lech Lecho, which is very, very interesting, you see. And we know the basic storyline of Parshas Lech Lecho, right, is Avraham Avinu, right? Avraham Avinu was commanded by God to leave Choron, which, by the way, they say is in modern-day Turkey, southeast Turkey, not far from Syria. Anyway, to leave and to go to Eretz Yisrael and Subsequently, there was a famine, and then he went to Egypt and so on. And when you look at the story of Lech Lecho and Avraham Avinu, and how he was designated by God to begin the whole process of rectification of creation, it's really very strange. And I'd like to talk about that because it has tremendous amount of lessons, messages for we, the Jewish people. And I'd just like to comment on these ideas. It's really a strange start. I mean, let's take a look at some of the ideas or the events that are really, like I say, strange to begin with. First of all, Avraham Avinu is 75 years old. Now, even in those days when people lived to an older age, they didn't live to 900, so let's say they lived to 105 or whatever. They were old men. A 75-year-old, even at that time, is an old man. It's not a young guy. So the question is, the Rebbe Hashem could have appeared to Avraham Avinu, right, when he was 30. What a difference. Then Avraham Avinu would have had all the youth, the energy, the dynamism of a young guy. I would imagine it would be a lot easier for him to do whatever he was charged with. So why would the Rebbe Hashem appear to an old man, 75 years old? How much energy does he really have? I mean, obviously we find the same thing by Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu is 80 years old. That is an old man. So why would he do that? That's the first strange idea about this story. Second thing is he tells Avraham Avinu, you have to leave who? You have to leave your place, your birthplace. You got to leave Beis Avicho. You have to leave your whole family. Do you know how difficult it is? You're 75 years old, and you're obviously thinking of retirement or whatever, and all of a sudden you have to leave everybody that you know, your family and your friends. Very difficult, Yet we find that the Rebbe Hashem told him, Lech lecho me'artzecho, your land, right? V'laditecho, your birthplace, and Beis Avicho, and from your father's home, which means your whole family and your friends and everybody, that you're close to. So again, that's a strange request to make of an old man. Then he tells him, right, that you're going to go to Elaorta Sherar Eka, to a land, right, that I will inform you of. He doesn't tell him where, right? Because it's important for somebody that's going to travel to have an idea of where he's going, because usually you want to be secure about that, so you make preparations. But he has no idea where he's going. So what the Rebbe Hashem did is he left him in a very insecure position. You see, he couldn't even prepare and think about where he's going and so on, and how to get there and so on. Why did he do that? Besides, when you go to a new place, he's not going for a vacation. He's going to live there. You know how difficult it is for an older person to adjust to a new place? Remember, he left his whole family behind. So he's got to adjust to a completely new place, new people, right? And so on. How does he do that? And then what about Parnasa? It's not clear what Avraham Avinu did. He probably was a shepherd, because that's what they did later. So, how do you make a Parnasa in a new place? He doesn't even know where he's going. You see, these ideas are very strange. They increase enormously the difficulty of what the Rebbeinu Shalom was asking him to do. Then what happens? He finally gets to Eretz Yisrael, and lo and behold, there's a phenomenal famine. It was one of the worst famines in human history, you see. All of a sudden there's a famine. So could you imagine, he gets to the land, I would imagine you could call it the Promised Land, because the Rebbeinu Shalom is telling him to go there. And then when he gets there, This is unbelievable famine, right? And everybody's starving. So he's got to decide, well, what do I do? I can't stay here. There's no food. Now, obviously, the one who orchestrated the famine is God, right? This doesn't happen by itself. It's amazing, right, that the Hashem arranged a famine at the time that he gets there. What a hardship. So where does he have to go? He has to go to Egypt, where apparently there was food. Yeah, but Egypt is a place of tremendous immorality, tremendous promiscuity, immorality, right? I mean, it's a real tumor place. So, obviously, I'm sure he was incredibly spiritual where he was, but now he's not only leaving Haran, so at least it was a place where he would be protected from immorality, and he's going to one of the most immoral places on the planet. You see, you know how difficult that is for a tzaddik to have to go in a mokum tumah like Egypt. This increases enormously his difficulties. And besides that, Avraham Avinu realizes that his wife is a very beautiful woman. And he knows what they're going to do, right? Pharaoh is always looking out for new pastures. And Sarah is one of them. So he realizes that, if he is her husband, guess what? They're not going to hesitate to kill him and bring her to Pharaoh, you see. So the whole trip to Egypt, if you think about it, is life-threatening. Imagine that. To go to Egypt in his situation is life-threatening. Yet that's what he has to do. And then he's got to travel to Egypt. You know how difficult it is to travel in those days? We're not talking here about cars, trains, buses, planes, right? We're talking about camels. How do people go from Haran all the way to Eretz Yisrael, all the way to Egypt? You probably traveled by camel. Could you imagine sitting on a camel or whatever, travel? It was very difficult to travel in those days, you see. So he's got to travel. Not only did he have to travel from Haran to Israel, but he now has to go to Egypt and schlep down all across the Sinai, the wilderness of Sinai. Imagine what that is, you see. And then what happens? Paroi kidnaps her. So Sarah says, well, he's my brother. Okay, so we can let him live. Meanwhile, they take her. That's called kidnapping. And that's exactly what Paro did. He kidnapped her. So now Avraham Avinu doesn't have his wife. But the real kicker in this is that he will never have her again. Why? Because the rule is that any kind of consort to a king can never go back to a regular person, because it's a bizoin to the melech, to the king. So even after he tires of her, Parai, she can't go back anyway to Avraham Avinu, because that's the rule. So that's the end of his marriage. Could you imagine he's in a country, and now what is he doing? Can you imagine? He's sitting in a motel in Egypt. He's broke. He's lonely. Sarah's been kidnapped, right? Could you imagine what he must be feeling like after being addressed by God to do this? Clearly then, he probably felt that the Rebbe Hashem had abandoned him. Because, when the Rebbe Hashem says something, and the Rebbe Hashem says to him, I will make your name great, right? The whole world will be blessed through you. I mean, he left him with tremendous amount of promise. Meanwhile, everything was the exact opposite of what he promised, right? What do you mean everybody will bless me? They will be blessed through me. They just stole my wife, and I can never have her back, right? Not only that, what do you mean my name is great? My name is Mud. If I ever say that she's my wife, they'll kill him, right? And so on. So it comes out that everything the Rebbe Hashem promised, the exact opposite happened. I mean, take a look at all the things I just mentioned, So instead of a glorious trip, this whole trip became a nightmare, if you think about it. Why would the Rebbe Hashem do that? You see? And the answer to that is a very important concept. There are certain necessities, 3 things that the Rebbeinu Shalom had to do. And in essence, that's really what the story is about. And will answer the questions of why all of this nightmarish ideas happened. There are 3 things at that point in history that the Rebbeinu Shalom had to do. 1, the Rebbeinu Shalom needed somebody to rectify creation, a masakin, you see. The second thing the Rebbeinu Shalom needed to do was that the guarantee, which is called another yichud, which I once spoke about, that guarantee has to cover, right, specifically, not in general, but specifically, whoever's going to be the masakin, means the one who is going to rectify creation, you see. And the third thing is that they have to now go and rectify creation. So the Rosh Hashanah needs those 3 things at this point in time. So then the question is, who was the masakin? Well, I had mentioned, many times in the past, in the beginning, the original idea of God was that man, rather Jews, should not be the masakin. Rather, it should be mankind. That's why Adam Arishan, he was not Jewish, he was human. Because the original intent of God was that Adam Arishan should do the tikkun and all his descendants. So the concept or the job of tikkun, right, was given to mankind, not the Jewish people. The problem is that mankind sinned for 2,000 years. You had the Mabel with Noach, then you had the Dor HaFlaga, the generation of dispersion, where he spread them throughout the planet and so on, right? So this is what you had, you see. So the Rebbeinu Shalom needed somebody that would do the job of tikkun, because mankind was not doing it. So the Rebbeinu Shalom decided a very important test. And here's the test, which, by the way, has tremendous repercussions for the history of man. 1, he decided that he would make 2 people very powerful and famous. One was Nimrod, and the other was Avraham Avinu, you see. So Avraham Avinu, of course, defied Nimrod, right, by smashing all his idols of his father Terach, right? And he decided to throw Avraham Avinu into a kivshon or ish. This was Nimrod, right? So the question was, and of course Avraham Avinu was saved. So what the Rosh Hashanah decided is this test. If mankind would go after Nimrod, and we find this at the end of Parshas Noach, where it says, and the earth was one language and one nation, right? So you did not have the 70 nations. You had only one, in Bavel, in Babylon. In any case, there it's in the land of Shinar. And the head of that was Nimrod. And that's where Avraham Avinu came from. In any case, if the people of that place, Shinar, if they would follow Nimrod, right, then what the Rebbeinu Shalom would do, right, is take away the ability of mankind to do the tikkun. He would diminish their neshamas. Because even a goy has a neshama elyono. He has a holy soul, which God allowed him to keep. But he would take away the neshama that can do the tikkun on the entire creation and give it only to Avram. Or he would allow Avram Avinu to have it, you see. But if the nation followed Avraham, especially after the Ness, imagine a guy gets thrown to an enormously hot furnace and he walks out, survives. If they follow Avraham Avinu, then he would not do that. He would allow mankind to continue to do the tikkun. It's up to them. This was the great test by the Dor HaFloga. So what did they decide? They decided to follow Nimrod and to rebel against God. Therefore, what the Rabbi did is he spread them throughout. But what he really did is he took away all of their ability to do the tikkun, you see. And the only one who remained as an individual who could do the tikkun is Avraham Avinu. He's the only one that remained, you see. And that's pivotal. That is why the Barsham now appeared to Avraham Avinu to make an agreement, a covenant with him, to do the tikkun, he and his descendants. Now, that is a very important event. Why? Because here's the story. As long as, all mankind can do the tikkun, right? So then either they do it or they don't. But once the Rebbe decides to take it away from all mankind and leave it with Avraham Avinu, what's going to happen is Avraham Avinu and his descendants is going to need time to do the tikkun. But meanwhile, the rest of the mankind who used to be able to do tikkun will sense the greatness of Avraham Avinu and the Jewish people. So in the end, what they will do is kill Avraham Avinu and his descendants. Anti-Semitism. I'm not going to go into the origin, but this is the beginning of the origin. The difference in the shamas between a Jew and a goy. So what does that mean? That means you're going to have the nation of the world, or whatever, against Avraham Avinu. And Avraham Avinu is only one person, even with his descendants. Meanwhile, the rest of mankind, of course, will try to interfere with Avraham and kill him. So what the Barsham therefore decided is that in order for Avraham Avinu to survive and do the tikkun with his descendants, he has to split the nations up. So he did. And that's the story of the Dor HaFloga, where they rebelled against God. So what he did is he changed their language and he spread them throughout the world. So now there becomes 70 nations, right, plus the nation called Avraham Avinu. And because they are now split, they will war against each other and let Avraham Avinu and his descendants do the tikkun. Of course, they still hate Avraham Avinu. And look how much anti-Semitism resulted from this. But the reason why God, spread the peoples around the world, why that? Is because that would be necessary in order for Avraham Avinu to do the tikkun, especially since Rabbi did not want to destroy mankind. But if he leaves them exist, the problem is they ultimately will annihilate Avraham Avinu and his descendants. And therefore he has to split them into 70 nations, not one, and spread them throughout the entire world. Because that's the only way the Jewish people can survive, is if the nations are split and spread throughout the world. Now, what is interesting about this particular idea is this, is that when the nations are together, Jews will not survive. There'll be an unbelievable amount of anti-Semitism. And that's the reason why God split them, so the Jew and Avraham Avinu and his descendants can do the tikkun. So therefore we see that when the nations are united together, they will destroy the Jews. Because then the natural proclivity or tendency to hate spirituality and to hate the one who can masaken will arise. Therefore, in the end of time, when the tikkun is almost complete, 98% of the tikkun is complete, then God does not need the nations to be split. Instead, he wants to bring the nations together again, you see. So therefore, it will become obvious who Avraham Avinu and who the Jews are, you see. And they all together will war against the Jewish people, because that's always what happens when the nations are together. The natural tendency of anti-Semitism will again rise. So guess what? God puts in the mind of man that all the nations should unite. And lo and behold, in 1948, there is an institution called the United Nations. Right. Why was the UN created? What we now understand is the UN, right, is an undoing of the generation of dispersion. Because at that time, 4,000 years ago, you needed to split the nations. So Avraham Avinu and his descendants could do the tikkun, notwithstanding all the anti-Semitism, because now the nations fight with one another, and they pay less attention to the Jewish people. But as we approach the Messianic era, you see, then God doesn't need that anymore, because the tikkun is 98% complete. So now it's okay for all the world to be together, as opposed to the Jewish people. And then all of them single-handedly, or as one nation, will now realize who the Jews really are. But in order to do that, God has to put in the mind of man, right, something of current events. So what they have is the idea to have a UN. And what does the UN do? It unites the nations. But wait a minute. We know that when the nations are united, what happens? They will hate the Jews. They'll use that as a platform to kill the Jews. That's exactly what happens. If you look at the UN, we know there's a double standard. There are so many nations in the UN that are murderers, right? Criminals, people who kill people, and so on, right? And the UN does nothing about them. Whereas in terms of the Jews, the whole UN, right, opposes Israel. There's resolution after resolution. I remember reading an article, in those days it was called Reader's Digest, and they had an article on the UN. So they write something interesting. They said, why is it that 93% of all the resolutions of the General Assembly, which is the main body of the UN, why are they all anti-Israel? And we now know why. Because that's what happens when the nations unite, right? The natural tendency of anti-Semitism rises. And since we are now, in fact, the fact that there is a UN is one of the proofs that we are at the end of time. And it's one of the proofs that the tikkun process is almost complete. And that happened, right, in 1948. So you can imagine how much closer we are, you see. So that's a very interesting historical concept, isn't it, of why there's a UN, which goes back 4,000 years, of why the Baruch Shem chose Avraham Avinu, so he and his descendants can do the tikkun. So therefore, the first spiritual requirement that the Rabbi Shem needed, right, is he needed a Masakin. And therefore, he instituted the test between Avraham Avinu and Nimrod. Now, the second thing that happened is that Avraham Avinu said to the Baruch Shem, in the Bris Ben Absarim, the covenant between the pieces, he said, look, I understand that you want me to do the tikkun and so on, right? However, what happens if the Jews sin, right? You're going to destroy them like you destroyed the nations of the world, the Mabul. So what's the point? What's the guarantee? Because I'm sure that my descendants will sin. So the Rabbi Shem said, look, I have an Haga called Yichud, the conduct, the behavior that I exhibit to guarantee that the world must continue, right? That covers mankind in general, but not any specific nation. But now that you're the Masakin and nobody else is, I will guarantee the existence and survival of the Jewish people to do the tikkun. And that, by the way, is why it is impossible to kill the Jewish people en masse. Yes, Jews must survive somewhere to continue the tikkun. Oh yeah, they can be punished on a national level, but they cannot be destroyed. and it doesn't make a difference. The last one who could have destroyed the Jewish people en masse, all of them, was Ahasuerus. That was the last time in history that the entire Jewish people was under the control or the sovereignty of one king. That's why Haman was so dangerous, you see, because he could have wiped out every Jew. But obviously he didn't, because they have the Hanogas HaYichud that protects them. So obviously he was killed, and obviously none of the Jews, because they did tshuva. But in any case, this is a very important idea. So that was the second requirement. Not only does he appoint Avraham Avinu to be a Masakin, right? But the second thing he does is he now changes the attribute of guarantee that they will cover specifically the Jewish people. And the third requirement is he now tells Avraham Avinu, look, they must do the tikkun. So there is a Masakin, namely you and the Jews. The Hanogas HaYichud now exists, and that is manifest in the agreement itself, where it says that Avraham Avinu, that God went through the pieces of the covenant, because that's what the covenant was, where you would cut an animal in half, and God would go through as an agreement. He went through as a torch and as a furnace. So the torch is if the Jews do the tikkun in the correct way, and God will go through as light, you see. But if they don't, then the Hanogas HaYichud will protect them, and I will go through as a furnace. And Rashi says that this furnace represents Gehenna, right? And that means that they will suffer in order to have a kapara and so on, and therefore their existence will be guaranteed. Either way, they will do the tikkun, you see, because what the Avraham needed was, since Avraham Avinu would now do the tikkun, it wasn't sufficient to do the tikkun, right, that remains. He had to, because if you can do tikkun, you can also do kilkul. In other words, if you can rectify creation, you can also damage creation. So what the Avraham needed, right, is Avraham Avinu and his descendants have to undo all the damage that mankind, when they had the ability of tikkun, they had to undo that. And therefore the way they would have to undo that is they have to go into a nation, right, that represents the evil, the satanic evil and so on, and remain righteous. That was the whole point of Egypt, you see, because that was the way the Jews could do the tikkun, you see, by undoing all the damage that mankind did for 2,000 years. The Jews would have to undo that. And how would they undo that? By remaining righteous in a land called Egypt, you see. And if they didn't do the tikkun, then they would have to suffer, and they would do the tikkun through the suffering and so on. But in any case, God required all three things. He needed a Masaken, which I've just explained. He needed Hanogas HaYichud to especially guarantee the survival of the Jews. And he had to have Avraham Avinu and his descendants, right, to undo the kilkul, the damage of 2,000 years. Because remember, if you could do the tikkun, then you could also damage creation. So since everybody until Avraham Avinu could do the tikkun, he had to undo their kilkul, their damage. You see? So he needed those three things. That's a very important idea. And this is a significance of Lech Lecha. You begin to realize this is fundamental to the whole mission of the Jew who took over what mankind should have done, you see. And therefore what God did, he said, okay, this is what I need to do, right? They have to do the tikkun and so on. But I have to send them now lessons, right? They have to learn the lessons in order to be able to do this. So the first thing he needed to do was to test the loyalty of Avraham Avinu, right? You see, to test the loyalty of Avraham Avinu. And therefore, he wanted Avraham Avinu to begin this sense of mission as an old man, you see, not a young man, for two reasons. As an old man, if he would do this, that would test Avraham Avinu's loyalty, that even as an old man, he will do what God wants. So this is a loyalty test. The second reason why he wanted Avraham Avinu to initiate this as an old man, right, is to avoid the mistake. Because you could say, well, Avraham Avinu was an incredibly dynamic leader, a young guy, and because he was young with the energy and vitality, that's why he was able to do what he did. So God said, no, he's going to be an old man, right? So obviously it's not because he's dynamic and youthful. On the contrary, the only reason why I could do the tikkun is because of me, because of God. So by choosing an old man, God would prove that all of this would be because of God's assistance and not because of his own character. In fact, that's the reason why, one of the reasons why Moshe stuttered. Because we could say, well, Moshe was an incredible orator. But the truth is, he wasn't, because he stuttered. You see? So, because the Moshe wanted to show that the ones who are commanding him to do everything is God, not Moshe. Because Moshe had a stuttering problem. And that's not the only reason why, but that clearly indicates, well, he couldn't have done it by himself because the man stuttered, so what kind of speaker is he? Same thing with Avraham Avinu. Obviously, he couldn't have done it himself. The guy's an old man. It has to be because the Rebbe Shem assisted him to do the whole tikkun. It's a very important concept. But certainly, he needed the loyalty. The second thing that the Rebbe Shem showed Avraham Avinu is that this is not going to be a picnic. This is very hard. The path to tikkun is a very difficult path. You know, you think, well, now that he's going to go to the promised land, everything is going to be, as they say in English, hunky-dory. No way. You see, you're going to come to a place that makes no sense, Eretz Yisrael, in the middle of a famine, and you're going to then have to go to Egypt in the middle of the Tumah, right? You mean this is what I have to do the tikkun? Yes. This is a very hard job. It's like a warning to Avraham Avinu. Don't think this is going to be a picnic. No. It's going to be a very hard job. That's a second lesson that the Rebbe Shem had to tell Avraham Avinu. You see. Then the Rebbe Shem had to show Avraham Avinu that, I want to tell you something. You think that I'm going to always look consistent? No. I'm going to look at you with constant contradictions. Right. You're going to say, I don't believe what's happening. You tell me to go to Eretz Yisrael, right? And when I get there, it's not the promised land, right? It's filled with the worst kind of famine. What a contradiction. You see, in terms of what the Rebbe Shem commanded. So what the Rebbe Shem was telling him is, this is what it's all about. It's going to look like I'm contradicting myself, but really it's part of my anhoga. This is the way it has to go, you see? So you need to understand. You need to have bitochen, trust. You need to trust me that even though everything looks contradictory, right? It's not contradictory, really. It only looks contradictory to you, but in the end, it'll all work out. So that's the next lesson, you see, that the Rebbe Shem is telling him. That not only will there be contradictions, right, but you have to have bitochen, that there are no contradictions. And that's one of the ideas of the Akedah, you know, which I once spoke about. There's a whole shiur on that. You know, the Akedah looks like a tremendous contradiction, but it wasn't, you see. In any case, so that was another lesson that Avraham Avinu had to learn. You see, all these lessons he has to learn because he has now been designated, right, as a tikkun. Not only that, but Avraham Avinu realizes something else. He's an old man. How in the world can he change the world? You see? And not only that, he has no kids. I mean, Sarah's what? She's 90 years old, and he's 100. How in the world can he possibly have kids? So that's another lesson that the Baruch Hashem is teaching him. You see, why? Because the Jewish people exist only through miracles. The whole origin of the Jewish people, that Sarah at 90 had a child, is a nes niglo. It's an open miracle. It's impossible, in fact. In fact, when Yitzchak was born, everybody thought that Paro is the father, you see. And then he made Yitzchak look like Avraham Avinu, so they realized it wasn't. But how in the world can a 90-year-old woman have a child? Impossible, right? Like Sarah said, she herself said, is impossible. But the Jews exist because of a miracle. The whole anhoga, the whole behavior of the Jewish people is miraculous, from their birth through their survival and their ability to do tikkun. So we see something very important. All of these are lessons that the Baruch Hashem had to give Avraham Avinu in order that he should have these basic beliefs to surmount all the incredible amount of obstacles. And that's why he told them, you have to get away from, Haran and your entire family. Because in order for you to do the tikkun, you need to leave the tumah. And we know that Terach, the father of Avraham Avinu, and the whole family, they were steeped in Avodah Zarah. You see? So that is one of the requirements to do the tikkun, is don't mingle with evil. Don't mingle with tumah. You have to separate yourself. You see? And you have to have bitochen, which I said is one of the lessons, right? Is one of the lessons that Avraham Avinu had, you see? And by introducing a famine to Eretz Yisrael, the Baruch Hashem told them, your life, the whole history of the Jewish people, is going to be filled with contradictions, right? Contradictions. That I promised one thing, and I seem to be delivering something else. You see, because you have to learn that the way I act, God is saying, is beyond your comprehension. You see, but in the end, it will all fit in. It will all make sense. So you need to have bitochen, trust, that everything I'm doing is gamzul tova, is only to allow you to do the tikkun, and therefore to get olam haba. You see, and even though Egypt is life-threatening, that's the sacrifice that God requires of Jews. You see, that you have to do the tikkun, you have to do my will, even though it could be, as I said, life-threatening. And the concept of Pharaoh taking, right? Could you imagine Pharaoh takes Sarah, right? And that's it. That's the end of the marriage, because she cannot go back to Avraham Avinu, because she is the consort of a king. So could you imagine Avraham Avinu is an old man and his wife is gone? Could you imagine sitting in some motel, right, in Thebes, which is Luxor in those days, right? And he's completely alone. There's nothing there. Not only that, he must have a tremendous feeling that the Rebbe Shem abandoned him. Could you imagine what kind of a test he had? We think about, could you imagine if you were in his shoes, right? And after visiting you and promising you such incredible glory, where the whole world will be blessed through you, right? All of a sudden, everything turns around. It's a nightmare, isn't it? Right? You have to maintain. You have to maintain that trust in God. So we understand something very interesting, that God had 3 requirements that was critical, and that's what Lech Lecha is. 1, he needs somebody to do the tikkun, and he provides the last test for mankind, which has repercussions in current events. The second thing he needs is that Tanogas HaYichud, the guarantee that there will be a nation in Olam Haba, now devolves upon the Jewish people. And the third thing is that they, Avraham and the Jewish people, have to go and undo all the kilkul, the damage, of course, of all mankind's sinning. for 2,000 years. And that's exactly what happened. And that's why they had to go to Egypt to remain righteous. In any case, and therefore, he had to teach Avraham Avinu these incredibly important lessons, right? What are the lessons? One, you must be loyal. No matter what happens, right? You need to be loyal to God and do what he wants. Second lesson, Tikkun is going to be very hard. This is not a picnic, as I said. And you have to be prepared to accept that it's not going to be easy. You see, not easy always to do a mitzvah, especially in a place of tremendous amount of temptations. Third lesson, I'm going to appear in many ways as contradictory, right? And you're going to say, this doesn't make any sense. Hashem doesn't do this. Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. You must accept the contradictions and realize that this is known only to God why he has to act this way, right? But in the end, it's all part of the tikkun, you see? And therefore, you must have bitochen. Very important idea. The next lesson is that the tikkun can only happen through miracles. The Jews can only do the tikkun. They can only survive. It's all based on nisim, miraculous ideas, miracles. And the Jews have to understand that because it's miracles, they will get the job done. And that is a very important idea. And what was interesting, by the way, is Avraham Avinu became tremendously wealthy. You know who made him wealthy? Parai. Because Parai, realizing when the Bansham appeared and he shut down every orifice in the entire palace's body, all their bodies, that was it. Every excretory function ceased. And obviously they were not going to survive more than a day or two. They realized what is going on, you see? And therefore, Parai realized who Avraham Avinu is. This is not an ordinary man. Do you imagine? And he's Parai, the great Parai of Egypt, right? The king of Egypt, right? And in the eyes of God, this man's a zero plus his entire nation, right? And that God will do the bidding of Avram to help him and save him. So he realized who Avraham Avinu was. And as a result of that, right, he gave him a tremendous amount of cattle, sheep, gold, jewelry, whatever. And in many ways, he's the one who gave Avraham Avinu tremendous amount of wealth. And also, by the way, Hagar, who's the she was a princess of Egypt. That's why she left Parai and she joined Avraham Avinu, because she'd rather be a maidservant in the house of Avraham Avinu, such an incredibly holy man, right, than be a princess of Egypt. So what comes out of this is very interesting. It's a paradox. The very nightmare situation that he had, sitting in this motel in the middle of the night and wondering that's the end of his marriage. In fact, that's the end of his mission. How in the world is he going to get out of this mess? It's impossible. That is the very situation that made him fabulously wealthy. You see? Go figure how the Moshem can pull this off. That he can take your nightmare, and that nightmare itself becomes the vehicle for your salvation. Amazing, isn't it? And that's what Avraham Avinu realized. So now we understand Lech Lecho is not merely a parsha. It is what's called the rules of how to do the tikkun. It is the basic understanding and the beliefs that you need to have to engage in the entire tikkun process. And that's why we have this strange story of Avraham Avinu in Parshas Lech Lecho. Any questions?
So, in order for us to be redeemed, do we? Is it the same way, like through strange situations where the Jews are going to be put in these circumstances,
right,
and then we're waiting for that miracle?
Right. Exactly what happened to Avraham Avinu happens to the Jews. Same thing. Not all of it happens to one person, obviously. But every Jew experiences in his life mysteries that he cannot understand. Why did this happen? How come I met that guy? Why did I lose my job? All of this happens to the Jewish people. Different aspects of the lessons that I've said that the Banshma has to teach Avraham Avinu, right? Because the tikkun is not a simple job. It entails a tremendous amount of mysteries. Not only what's obvious, but the Hanodas HaYichud demands is the way to get Jews into Ilam Habo, even though we don't understand it. But in the end, in the Messianic era, all of this will be revealed. The logic of every act of God will be revealed, you see. But this is what happens. This is all part of the tikkun process. And it had to be demonstrated to Avraham Avinu.
The same thing happened to Moshe when he was chosen, and then we had the decree of the straw. So
right.
Are we also expecting that with Mashiach ben Yosef?
Are we also expecting what?
That with Mashiach ben Yosef, meaning, okay, let's say you're right, God willing, the eclipse on Hashkafa was great, and he was released. Now, are we expecting it to get worse because that was the pattern?
Yes. And I gave a whole shiur on that. Exactly. That was what I said. That is why Trump, who initiates the Mashiach of Edom, was dumped. Exactly. And that's why Biden took over. Because evil has to have its due. Because justice demands that both sides, right, have free expression. And therefore God said, okay, I'm giving you complete dominion. And that is why you see these Rishoyim, incredible. The media, Biden, the Democratic Party, the progressives. You can't believe what's going on. The immorality, the education, all about perversions. I mean, it's hard to believe America has become this because all of it means is that evil has been given dominion. And the same thing in Eretz Israel. It's one of the worst governments, if not the worst government, against Judaism that Israel has ever seen, right? Where the Erev Rav has complete shlita, dominion, right? That is the equivalent of the straw. But like I once said, because all of it has to satisfy justice.
So how do we know that the evil has gotten its fill? Meaning now we have elections coming, and
that is why, yes, that is why the election in Israel on November 1st and the election in America on November 8th is critical. If the Democratic Party gets slaughtered, then that is the beginning of the end of the evil decree that they should have, free reign. It's over, you see. In fact, one of the things which is interesting, one of the things that they can do, and that's how they control everybody, is the social media, censorship. It's unbelievable. If you say the wrong thing that they don't like, which is against democratic, the policies of the Democratic Party, they'll kick you out of, what do you call it, Twitter or Facebook or whatever. But what's happened is that Elon Musk has now taken over Twitter, and he's going to make it an open platform. That is a tremendous blow to the Democratic Party. Because now, even if they all hide, that's how they survive. That's how they dominate. Because the media does not report anything. It does not report any of the evil. So the amazing thing is Musk has now damaged, their conspiracy, their cover-up. That has to mean the end.
So, Rabbi, when you said this is a good month for the Jews, is that what you're meaning? Is that Hashem is trying now to put things in place?
Right.
Okay.
Right,
okay.
Exactly. So the fact that Musk has bought Twitter is a very good sign. And the next very important sign, obviously, is the Israeli elections, and also, obviously, November 8th, to see what happens. Because if the Democratic Party gets crushed, that is the beginning of the end of evil. Right.
And most of the Republicans believe in God. most of them are, they're
right.
always invoking God in it. So
yes.
maybe it will be a turnaround.
Maybe.
Okay.
Look, we'll know in less than 2 weeks.
But Rabbi, they say that there's going to be a lunar eclipse on November 8th, and a lunar eclipse is so how do we explain that? Does the solar eclipse a lunar eclipse? How do we
The way I could explain it, although it is rather strange, is that there's a last attempt of the evil to dominate. So the lunar eclipse is like the last resurgence of evil. But I think it's been completely overshadowed by a solar eclipse. So the fact that both of them happen in the same month, and that month happens to be the Messianic month of Hezron, I think bodes tremendously good for the Jewish people. Now, notwithstanding an attempt of evil to dominate, the solar eclipse means they lost, because that is much more significant, I believe, a solar eclipse than a lunar eclipse. You see.
Okay, that's good news.
Well, that's my feeling.
So now, you think because we know that there's going to be voter fraud and they're going to cheat their way through to try to, we'll wake up in the morning and it, like what happened with Trump. He was winning, he went to sleep, and then he woke up and he's lost. So you think because Elon Musk bought Twitter, that more of the, all their sneakiness could be uncovered,
revealed.
Easily.
Right, exactly. And that was the problem, because Trump did not have the media supporting him. So it was really a one-way story. But if you have Twitter, do you know that Facebook lost 20% of their stock value?
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody's going over to Twitter.
Yeah.
Well, that itself, could you imagine? I think they have 1 billion subscribers. Could you imagine what 20% of loss is? And that's only now. You see, it's because people don't want to be restricted and censored. So they're all moving over to Twitter. So therefore, they cannot get away with anything that they want to do. It'll be exposed, and that's the last thing they want, is any kind of exposure. Until now, one of the problems that Trump had is that there's nobody willing to, reveal it. So they got away with it, but not now. And besides, I think there will be a greater vigilance because everybody's aware of what these guys are probably planning. So
they have a lot of poll watchers. They have a lot of poll watchers now.
Right. I'm sure they're going to take actions, to try to prevent, because they're now aware of what these guys are going to do,
Rabbi, can I ask you, this is Soraya, can I ask you about what's happening with Kanye West and all of the balagan that he's creating, and people are, the banner in California and all of these anti-Semitic.
Well, Kanye, look, I don't really know much about this guy. What is he, a rapper of some sort? Whatever, anyway. Who is he? He's basically a nobody. Just a very wealthy guy, whatever. But all it is the old anti-Semitic things. I find it very interesting that he's had a tremendous reaction against him. You know how many companies have dumped him? The guy has to have lost hundreds of millions of dollars. He had a contract with Adidas. That's worth a fortune. And his only agent quit. I'm sure he's saying to himself, boy, am I stupid. Even if I felt this way, why should I have said it openly and publicly? I'm sure that's what he's saying. What do I need this for? And he is an idiot. Even if you feel this way, how do you go and say and publicize this? Because a great deal of the world, they don't want to be anti-Semitic, even though there are many people that do anti-Semitic acts, but there is a part of the world that will not tolerate it. You see? He made an incredible mistake. You see? And that's an einish. I have no idea who he is or what he is, but, he's going to suffer terribly because of this. I mean, he's still worth hundreds of millions of dollars, I understand. But that's how I see it.
Is Cheshvan the month of Esav or the month of Yaakov?
It's the month of Yaakov.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so Rabbi, what should we do specifically on the 11th of Cheshvan on Rachel Imenu's Yahrzeit?
Well, it's her Yahrzeit. Maybe I think would be interesting. By the way, there's a lot of things going on in Rachel Imenu's Yahrzeit. Actually, in her kever, there are, I think, 7 or 8 koilim in her kever. I don't know if you realize that. There's round-the-clock learning going on at her gravesite. So I think what could be interesting is to call them up and to make a donation to keep the Torah going in the name of, and you can give your name in and request a tefillah, shidduch, whatever you need, parnasa and so on, is to make a donation to Kever Rachel before the 11th of Cheshvan. That would be very appropriate.
You have the number, Rabbi?
Do I have the number? I'm not sure, but you should be able to find it. You know what you do? Go on the internet, Rachel Imenu, Kever Rachel Imenu. I'm sure it's on the internet. I mean, it's well known. You shouldn't have a problem. I mean, they've been advertising, actually.
Rabbi, you want to hear something interesting?
Take us up on the speaker.
Yeah.
Rabbi, the name Avraham Avinu has all the 10 nisyanot as a remez.
Yeah, hello?
Talk louder, Rachel.
If you spell out the name Avraham Avinu,
yeah,
each letter stands for another one of his nisyanot, one of his 10.
Oh, yeah? That's interesting. Okay.
If you spell Avraham, Aleph, or Kazi, Bet, Brit Ben Habitarim, the Resh was the Ra'av in the land. The He was Hagar when he had to get rid of her. The Mem was Milchamet HaMelachim, the war with the 4 kings, with the 5 kings who went to save Lot.
Yeah.
Aleph Avinu is Avimelech when you have to go to fight again. Then the is the Brit Milah, the Yud is back with the Akedah. The Nun is Navinad when he had to go travel Lech Lecha, like a
nomad.
And
very nice.
Last letter, the Vav, is Isha Bet Paro, when they took his wife to Paro's palace.
Yeah. Very nice.
You know?
Yeah, very nice. Okay.
God willing, with his merit and the merit of Rachel Imenu, and this is the month of Sarah Imenu's Yahrzeit also this month, no?
Right.
Yes, it is.
Right.
When did Sarah die?
What was that?
Next week is Lech Lecha. Vayera Chayisara in 2 more weeks. It's going to be her.
Yes. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right.
So this is the month of very powerful people to pray for Am Yisrael.
Right. By the way, Yud Aleph Cheshvan is my birthday.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Happy birthday.
Thank you. So,
Happy birthday.
Thanks. Yeah. So, to me, the month has a special significance because it's my birthday, Yud Aleph Cheshvan.
Like Rachel Imenu.
That's the Yahrzeit of Rachel Imenu, correct?
It's really the Od Harishon.
It's all that.
Yes.
Right? She was the Yahrzeit of Rachel Imenu is Yud Aleph Cheshvan, and that was the day the Mabul should have happened, which is the Orishon, right? It's all Yud Aleph Cheshvan.
Wow.
Anyway.
Rabbi, come on, we need the Mashiach. What do you think that the Republicans are going to win?
I'm hoping that it's going to be a crush, that they will crush the Democrats, right? That this
but
nation
at the end
will
of
wake
the day,
up.
Rabbi, at the end of the day, if Hashem wants it to be changed, it will be changed, right?
Of course.
Really,
of course.
It's really all. We have to do our part by voting.
Right.
That's it.
Oh, yeah. You have to vote. Of course, yeah. And whatever you do, don't vote for Hochul. She is destroying New York State.
Yes.
She's a very evil woman.
Very.
Yeah. Zeldin hopefully will be able to turn it around. What they've done to New York State is terrible.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
And if, God forbid, we are losing.
If what?
God forbid. God forbid.
I know, but if, God forbid, we do lose, Hashem is trying to show us that we didn't do enough, we're not relying on Him enough, we're not...
Well, it's hard to know, but the main idea is that it's not the time. There is still more to do.